put those on.
There we go.
And first thing I want to do, if you don't mind, is I keep forgetting to do this, is get you doing just a little ID, like, hi, this is Kenneth Gavin, and if you want to say from where or just your name, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Whatever you feel most comfortable with.
Yeah.
And you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg. Hold on.
This is Ken.
Sorry, I should hit record first. Okay.
This is Ken Gavin, and you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
All right, so turn these on now. All right, so my knowledge, the extent of my knowledge for the Revolution, Gettysburg during the Revolution, is that the Dobbin House was built in 1776.
Correct.
That's about as far as it goes.
Okay.
So anything beyond that is, you teaching me, and I'll just, do you? So some people come in here and they're very prepared and they do it like it's a presentation, and then sometimes I'll interrupt them with a question, and it seems like it's throwing them off. Are you more that style, or can you do conversational?
We can do conversational.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
I've got some ideas about what I want to discuss, but
well, give me some bullet points then, so that I can lead you into them.
Sure. So, my thought on this whole thing, Matt, was sort of to start off with a discussion that links the time periods of 1863 and the mid-1770s, because I think there are some political and philosophical things that really are inextricable there, as sort of an intro lead-in, and then to do a comparison of what does the area look like in the 1770s and the 1860s. Of course, Gettysburg doesn't exist until 1786, but it's Straben and Cumberland townships for the most part that are going to make it up. So there are some things we can pull out of that comparative analysis, I think, and then to take a look at revolutionary themes as we move through that. And then I was hopeful, if we've got time, to talk a little bit about a few of the people from what will become Gettysburg who are veterans of the Revolution.
Yeah, okay.
And I've got some connective threads on big names that people will recognize from the Battle of Gettysburg who have a Rev War ancestor. So, we basically know what a John Sedgwick does. What does his grandfather, also named John, do during the Revolutionary War? And
so Gettysburg civilian Rev War veterans, and then descendants of Rev War veterans who fought in the battle.
Yep.
Basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I've got a few connections in terms of monumentation between here and Revolutionary War sites. And there's one woman I want to make sure that I do talk about, even if briefly, before we finish up today. Anna Morris Holstein. Anna Holstein was a nurse, and she was a chief matron at Camp Letterman in the fall of 1863. She's actually responsible for Valley Forge being preserved. So you've got people who are active participants at Gettysburg related to the battle, but then preserving a Revolutionary War site that later becomes a national park as well.
Okay.
That's sort of my general outlined approach. Yes, I have 34 pages of notes, but I want to make it conversational. So,
please don't read them.
No, God, Ken Rich will be banging down the door, and I will never be invited back.
Yeah.
And
how did you know? He's after you.
Yeah, well, the Patreon thing,
Oh,
it told me.
I forgot. Right, you're a patron as well. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I don't even know what we're talking about with Ken. Until yesterday, it said Ken Rich, 1:00.
right.
Subject to be determined, and I was like, oh no. Please don't. And then last night he goes, I was thinking maybe like infrastructure, like what was there when the battle happened? And I'm like, all right, obviously you have that information. Right. So let's do it, Yeah. And it'll be the same thing where Ken, it's a wild ride.
Yeah.
Because it's like he just goes. Right. And then every once in a while I got to go, wait, get back on the trail here. Like you're kind of going off.
I'm on a tangent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what are you talking about?
Does he always wear a red shirt?
He does. That's his signature.
Mm-hmm.
I used to always wear like a general's hat, and then I got sick of it, and so I stopped. Now I only wear it when it's raining. All right, so let's see. Good morning, Harry. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Jeffrey. How are you doing? Sorry, we started like 15 minutes or 10 minutes later than I had said because we got in the middle of talking, and I lost my track of time, but we're ready to start. You ready to start?
Ready to roll, man.
All right, here we go. And don't forget, if you need to, the bathroom's downstairs and whatnot. Water is in there, okay?
Very good.
All right, here we go.
From the
That's the wrong one.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, patrons. How are you today? You are in for a treat because we're doing something a little bit different, and we're doing something a little bit different with one of your brethren, Kenneth Gavin. And today we're talking about, I like the title of this, 77 years before. Not only does it rhyme, but it's also going back to what Lincoln is hearkening back to, and it's just a wonderful circle, or I don't even know what the hell you call it, what kind of shape it would be. But regardless, Ken is here. Ken has done a lot of stuff. It's a very long resume, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. But I did highlight some parts here that I think will make you believe what he says here. He's been a living historian, and he's a reenactor for over 2 decades, and he's had substantial experience with living history, public education, and reenactment programs relative to the American Revolution and the Civil War. He planned, staged, executed, and commanded living history programs and reenactments at the local and national level. Currently, he's the commander of the recreated Spencer's Additional Regiment of the Continental Line, with over a decade of experience as a commanding officer. At Valley Forge National Park, he served as a historic consultant and reenactor coordinator for a new interpretive film for the National Park Service, which replaced the film that has been there since the 80s. It's about time. Yeah. For 16 seasons, he's conducted substantive tours of Valley Forge National Historical Park for a broad demographic of visitors, responsible for coordinating several living history programs in conjunction with the National Park staff to commemorate the arrival of the Continental Army. That's page 1. Page 2, Teaching American History grant programs funded by the United States Department of Education, is Director of Field Study and Fellowship Program at the American Institute for History Education. He served as lead project manager for approximately 60 teaching. Wait, you said you're my age?
Yeah.
I've done absolutely nothing with my life.
We're both 39 forever, man.
That's right, we are. Oversaw planning, implementation, and logistics for approximately 450 professional development sessions each year. He's done keynote addresses, panels, and documentary appearances. You might have seen Eyewitness to the Battle of Princeton and Determined to Persevere, the Valley Forge encampment. He is the vice president of the Princeton Battlefield Society and also the Spencer's Additional Regiment of the Continental Line. That's page 2. And most interestingly, he's a model. He has his own signature look like blue steel, but he calls it cold gray. And he's modeled for Don Troiani and our friend Trexler Historical Art, as well as the Museum of the American Revolution in Pottsgrove Manor. Addressing Gettysburg.
Matt, I'm delighted to be here. I have listened for a long time, and I have to tell you, the moment is kind of surreal.
Really?
I appreciate. Yes, it is. Oh. I appreciate you highlighting the resume and bringing some things out. And That's all.
I appreciate you going along with my grandfather's silly, corny joke to pronounce it resume.
You know what?
It's keeping his memory alive.
When in Gettysburg or Gettysburg, depending on the debate.
Which do you say?
I say Gettys now. Well, there's a reason for that, and we might get into it later. And that's one of our town's founder, James Gettys. He is listed in Revolutionary Returns with a different spelling, and I think it's just because it's phonetics. I think he was spelling the name Gettys, but the rolls and returns in the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment is Geddes that is listed as there. So Gettys.
Really?
Yeah, and who am I to argue
But
with?
how do we know it's really him?
Well, that's according to the excellent research done by Melissa Gettys and Amanda Howlett, and we've written extensively on that, and ACHS had published that. And isn't Tim Smith saying we should say Gettysburg now?
Yes, Tim likes to be... We did an episode with Tim called, I think it was just Myth Busting with Tim Smith, because he loves bursting people's bubbles. And I think he likes to be a contrarian. He's trying to get this movement going to call Lower Culp's Hill Spangler's Hill, because technically Spangler owned it during the battle. And I don't disagree with that, but it's been Lower Culp's Hill for forever. And in the minds of Americans that know anything about it, it's Lower Culp's Hill, and there's just certain things that are hard to change just because they're correct. So I don't know. I think it's Gettysburg because people see the why.
Right.
And
well, no matter what you say, Matt, it's home for many of us, isn't it?
It is.
And while I'll do Gettysburg, and I may slip into a Gettysburg here and there, as for the Lower Culp's Hill thing, cool.
I think for today, it wouldn't be out of the question, since we're talking about the Revolutionary period, to refer to it as Gettysburg.
Right.
Okay? Because let's say it was Gettysburg at the time, or well, that wasn't at the time, but let's say it was pronounced Gettys, James Gettys, and then it was Gettysburg. And then eventually, through the years, as the popular imagination grabbed hold of it, it just became Gettysburg. And that's what we call it now. So let's pretend that it once was originally pronounced that way, and we'll make you and Tim very happy.
Very good.
Okay.
All
so
right.
so let's get into this here then.
Sure.
407 years before is the title of today's show, which I love.
I'm glad you like that.
Go into the political similarities between 1776 and 1860s. I mean, the Confederates especially harken back to that. I'm sure the Union did too, but the propaganda and all that other stuff. Yes?
Yeah, they do. And I think, for both sides, as it becomes very clear that there's going to be a military conflict, that we're going to engage in civil war, both sides have a philosophical need to claim that they are the true successors, the true torchbearers to the founding period of the nation. They are compelled to do that sort of thing. And Jefferson Davis, in his first inaugural address, says it outright. Basically, what the Southern states are doing, they are merely asserting a right which the Declaration of Independence of 1776 had defined to be inalienable.
Right.
And he goes on to sort of, make this legalistic argument that, well, the states are always sovereign, and that's really what we're trying to accomplish here. If you were to take a look at the articles of secession for each of the states that will formally secede from the Union, every one of them reads almost like a mini Declaration of Independence. Sure. They're just mimicking what has been said in 1776, and they're making slight tweaks to it. When the Confederacy establishes its own constitution, it's almost a mirror image of the U.S. Constitution, with the exception that it is specifically making allowance for slavery to continue on.
No, wait. So this is the problem that I have. Let's take slavery out of it for a second, and just everything else that you just said, right? And even in the movie, Gettysburg, where Pickett complicates the obvious and trivializes the momentous. This is where I'm torn on the Confederates. Mm-hmm. I don't believe anybody should be compelled to stay where they are not happy, where they are not comfortable, where they feel that they are being violated in some way or another, right? Mm-hmm. Imagine today we said, ladies, there's no more divorce in the United States of America. Like, think about that. Like, if we told people, You cannot get divorced. You cannot get out of a bad situation. Are you abused? Sorry, you can't get out. You have to stay and suffer that abuse, whether it's real or imagined, right? You have to stay. So the union argument to the secession is, we don't care that you're not happy. You have to stay here. You have to stay here and you have to like it. That's the way I see it. I think that's the way they saw it. Where they lose me is the big thing that they don't like is that the rest of the country seems to be realizing, maybe you shouldn't own people. Maybe that's not a good idea to own people. And they're like, oh, I don't like that. My rights are being violated. And I think that, had it been any other point or argument, right? I think even today they might still have some sympathy from people, but I think they lose me for sure when it's on the issue of owning people. I don't think you should do that. It's just wrong. No. But my point is, though, why was it okay for our founders to do it, but it's not okay for those within the union to do it if the union becomes a usurper of rights like the king was?
Right. Well, and there's a debate: is the king really usurping rights?
Well, and I would say no.
Right. And I think as we dig into this, you'll see that.
And by the way, I would also say Washington, not George, Washington, D.C. the federal government was not usurping rights leading into the Civil War.
I agree with you entirely.
I think it's all propaganda.
It is all propaganda because it all goes back to the connective thread of maintaining a slavery economy.
Right.
If you look at what Lincoln is saying in the late 1850s during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and this topic of slavery is coming up, I think there's an acknowledgement there that from a moral and ethical standpoint, the institution is abhorrent, and I think experience has shown that to Lincoln over the course. He's talking about how do we remedy this ill within society. He's not giving time frames for it. He's saying things like, I don't know how that will happen. This could take up to 100 years at that point in time. Preservation of slavery, without a doubt, is what the Confederacy is aiming for.
Sure.
Could an argument be made that an individual soldier on a battlefield is fighting and thinking of that? I think you'd be hard-pressed.
Of course.
But it is the connective thread that underlies absolutely everything that they're going to do. Interestingly, you looked at Davis's inaugural, which is delivered on February 18th of 1861, March 4th of 1861. Lincoln is going to deliver his, and, he's going to do the same thing Douglas does. He's going to hearken back to the Declaration, and he's going to say that, no, the Union is really the defender of what's been happening there. He'll say that the Union is older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774, matured and continued by the Declaration in 1776, further matured, and then the faith of all the then 13 states expressly plighted and engaged that it should be perpetual by the Articles of Confederation, and then he goes on to bring in the Constitution. So Lincoln, as a lawyer, is making, I think, a stronger legal argument there, but both sides are saying we're in the right. Both sides are saying we are the true successors to 1776, and they have to, because you have to motivate a population. And I think the South is struggling outside of the Deep South early on. Secession doesn't happen, boom, all at once like this, where you have all of these Southern states who say, you know what? Yeah, we're out. South Carolina goes first in December of 1860. But as you're moving into 1861, there's some doubt that places like North Carolina or Virginia are going to secede altogether. And during the course of the war, even, you'll see the Confederacy doing things to try to pull in Maryland and Delaware, places that are considered border states. And big level, Maryland invasion in 1862. But even down to smaller level things, a name that may be familiar to some of our listeners with a Gettysburg connection, a brigade commander in the 6th Corps here in 1863, Alfred Thomas Archimedes Torbert. He actually holds commissions in 2 armies at the same time, not because he wanted a commission from the Confederacy, but he's from Delaware, and Delaware is a border state. And he basically just gets a commission saying, hey, you're a lieutenant in the artillery. And he's like, well, that's crap. I'm going to rip this up because I'm serving the Union. But, they're always trying to pull that in. It's not, it's never immediate. We never, we always look at history and it's easy to fall into the trap of knowing the outcomes.
Yeah.
And assuming unified responses and missing the complexities Carl Becker, who was an historian working in the early 20th century, talks about historiography in very simple terms. And historiography, basically the way that we're going to remember events. And Becker says, look, there's an ephemeral event. It's something that happens. There's only one way it could ever happen in space and time. The affirmed version of an event is the story that is told by historians, or it's told through folklore tradition. And over time, that can change quite a bit. And it really lends into how are historical events remembered, how are they manipulated for political causes, and the way the affirmed event of the revolution is being used by both sides politically. At the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, I think is a really good example of that. You also have to remember that with the American Revolution and the American Civil War is short. It's 78 years from the end of one conflict to the beginning of another conflict.
It's almost like from World War II to now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's exactly where I wanted to go. We just passed the 80th anniversary of the Normandy invasion.
Yeah.
So, you and I are of that perpetually 39 age where, World War II veterans were a part of our youth.
Yeah.
We saw them.
Absolutely.
We were among them.
Yeah.
My grandfather served in the South Pacific in World War II.
Did he? South Pacific.
Yeah.
Oof.
So you have to then, if you transport yourself back into the 1850s or the 1860s, there are still Revolutionary War veterans among us. The last Rev War veterans that we know of died shortly after the Civil War, but they're out there. They're a part of communities. They are a part of people's lives. So there is that extremely tangible connection to a time that has gone before.
But imagine that for them. They're part of the generation that founded the country. They saw it go through all the growing pains, and then the biggest growing pain of all, it's adolescence, the Civil War. It's ripping itself apart. I mean, there must be some Rev War vets that you've found quotes from and had their thoughts on the Civil War.
It's difficult because by the time we get to the Civil War, the political and military leaders of that generation is long past. And from what we have from common soldiers of the period is really limited. Rev War is a hard period to research. It is much harder than 19th century. If you look at Civil War, you've got regimental histories out the wazoo. We've got tons of photographs that are famous from guys like Matthew Brady or other photographers, but we've got tons of studios that are producing CDVs. We've got all this great pictorial history of that. You have the veterans that are very involved and engaged in the aftermath and memorialization of things. For the American Revolution, with a base on both sides where most of the common soldiers have less literacy skills. They're more literate than people would have imagined, but they have less literacy skills. Surviving letters are fewer. There aren't those regimental histories. They weren't putting up these big monuments. A lot of the information that we're getting is from general orders from officers or orderly books from regiments that may survive. The tales of the common soldier, there are very few published memoirs. A few that come to mind are Joseph Plum Martin and John Greenman, Roger Lamb on the Crown side of things, Johann Conrad Dola, who's a German auxiliary. But there's less than 10 that you could probably think of off the top of your head that are surviving published diaries. So they're talking about the ephemeral events in real time, and when they get to the point where they're trying to remember the events, they're not passing pension acts until like 1818. For these guys. So there are a few veterans, but they're trying to prove service. So they're talking about what they did, but they're not reflecting in this political fashion. Like we don't get a lot of that, unfortunately. But you have to imagine that, for those who have lived through it, that it is a heartbreaking thing. But also look at early history of the Republic. I think it was always in question whether or not this thing was going to survive. 1790s, you've got the problems with France, and you've got a quasi-war going on over there. You've got impressment of American sailors by the British, the War of 1812. You're working through constant, modes of compromise, again, all connected back to slavery as new states come into the Union, that sort of thing, nullification crisis. So that time period leading up to the Civil War is, in my mind, and this is speaking in very broad brushstrokes because I am not an early Republic or 19th century political scholar, but to my mind, it's just constant moment of crisis, big or small, testing the republic. The republic survives in every instance, but the underlying thread that is ready to light the fuse is the existence of slavery and what's going to happen with that thing over time.
And you kind of alluded to this before that, the way we like to think of history is very cut and dry, and, everybody immediately coalesced with their side and everybody agreed, but that is not the case, on either side. Everybody thinks that, the South was all one thing and the North was all the other, but it wasn't. I mean, you had your anti-war people,
Sure.
you had your Unionists in the South and everything. I would imagine, I know that it was the same way during the Revolution. There's no period in human history when everybody agrees, even within the same side. Yeah. And I guess that's just the beauty of human beings. But so what was it like during the Revolution? It's a much different country. Paint a picture of what life in the American colonies was like.
Sure.
Prior to 1776.
Yeah, prior to 1776. Well, you have to look at it sort of in two periods. I think you have to look at it from sort of establishment of the colonies through 1763 and then post 1763.
Okay. And because 1763 is when we say the revolution really started and then the war started in 76. Like, how do you break that up?
So, to my mind, 1763 is an important date because it ends the French and Indian War.
Okay.
Right? What we call the 7 Years' War globally. And to my mind, that is sort of the seminal watershed existence of what will become Anglo society in North America in the 18th century. Because, the colonies, as they're established in the 17th and 18th century, Britain has claims here in North America, of course, largely clustered along the eastern seaboard. But the Spanish are staking claims in the south and what we know is Florida today. The French are certainly staking claims. They've got Canada, and they're moving down the, Richelieu, Lake Champlain, Hudson River corridor, and they're trying to take things that are Mississippi west, but then encroach in on British lands too. So there really are there are three major Anglo empires who are trying to claim a stake for North America in the 17th and 18th century. And let's not forget the people who are here. The natives who are here are a fourth empire in that because they exist and have very advanced societies and civilizations before Anglos ever arrive. But what the French-Indian War is, and this is the short version because I know it's not our topic today, that is France and Britain slogging it out globally to determine who will control the greatest empire the world has seen since ancient Rome. North America is the prize in that war because that's what's going to fuel resource for global empire.
Right.
And when Britain wins that war in 1763, that becomes the high point of pride to be a British colonist. The Spanish have been expelled. The French have been expelled. Ostensibly, colonists believe that natives are being pushed very far west, and then there will be endless economic opportunity here for them. And in Britain's eyes, this will be the keystone of empirical success in the entire Western Hemisphere. But when that war ends, Britain has to fund it, right? And that's going to start sort of a chain of events in the 1760s that'll lead to our flashpoint in 1775. But in 1763, I really don't think anybody saw this coming. You have colonists who fought hand in hand with the mother country in a long, bloody war, and this was supposed to be the dawn of a new age of greatness for Britain. And her North American colonies were going to play a center in that. And Britain needed those resources because, if you think about it, the home islands in England, that had been deforested for centuries. There's not a lot of supply base there. So Britain is dependent upon her colonial possessions for things like timber. They've got one of the greatest navies in the world, huge maritime fleets. Where's that timber coming from? It's coming from North America. Right. It's coming from the West Indies. All this other stuff is coming from other places too. So, post 1763, that period in time is one where I think it's looking very bright. You do have most of the settlements are clustered along the eastern seaboard in our 13, or what we consider our 13 original colonies anyway. And as you move further west, there are frontiers that are being developed over time. Cities are areas of commerce, but outside of Philadelphia and New York, there aren't, huge urban populations. Boston certainly could stake a claim. Baltimore to a much lesser degree. but most of the major urban populations are in New York and Philadelphia, Philadelphia being the largest. And then as you move westward, you're encountering farming communities and that sort of thing. And, you know, the vast majority of folks that you would find in what is now Adams County doesn't exist.
Right.
At the time, you know, it's Cumberland, it's Straben Township, it's all part of York County.
Right.
At that point, it won't exist until the town of Gettysburg until 1786, and then Adams County in 1800. The people that are out here and who are living in this area are going to be by and large farmers, but there are a lot of other professions as well. You know, if you look up and do the research on who's here, you find tanners who are leather makers, turners, merchants, tailors, weavers, wheelwrights, potters, gunsmiths, innkeepers, millers, blacksmiths, masons, coopers, hatters, carpenters, saddlers. And if you think about what all those professions are, well, they support community. You know, they make the things that you need to build up society out here.
But who is out here
Right.
now? So you're talking, you know, Philadelphia. It sounds like is basically the last city in Pennsylvania until you right. I mean, it's right there on the river, and what's beyond that?
Lancaster and York are population centers to a small degree, but you.
But out here, it's frontier.
Out here, it's frontier-ish. I think you could say it's an area that's starting to develop, and I think if we take kind of a look at 1775-ish, you know, what will become Gettysburg versus 1863, that becomes apparent. One of the first things that I looked at when I was thinking about this program is how many taverns are in the area.
Yeah.
Because taverns are going to be indicative of there's not just a static populace, but there is a population that's traveling through here to meet those needs with overnight accommodations, meals, etc. And I found that in 1775, for Straben and Cumberland townships, there is the Black Horse Tavern, the Geddes Tavern, John Campbell's Tavern, Joseph Hutchison's Tavern, Hugh McKean, Susanna McNutt, and Robert White also own taverns. So that's 1, 2, 3. It's like 7 taverns that are licensed, which tells me there's a lot of travel coming through in the 1770s. And that number of licensed taverns easily doubles by the time you get to the end of the war in 1783. Part of the reason for that is the transportation and road network that has been steadily moving west from Philadelphia during the 18th century. The development of roadways in this area, I think some of the first go in the 1740s. Black Gap Road and the Nichols Gap Road are successively opened in 1747, 1748, and that's moving sort of westward from Gettysburg, because Nichols Gap is maybe not a name that's familiar to most folks listening to the show, but I think many would know Monterey Pass and Blue Ridge Summit. So that is Nichols Gap. That's what that's called in the 18th century. And then as you sort of progress through time, we get a lot more of Hanover Road. And then, interestingly, by the time you get to 1770, there are at least 5 petitions filed in York County for road networks leading to the south to Baltimore. And these are mostly coming from families who are millers, because they want to get their grain to a port. And Baltimore is a hell of a lot closer than Philadelphia.
Sure.
And you don't have to cross the Susquehanna River to get down to Baltimore. So the economic and social connection with Baltimore that Gettysburg experiences starts in the 18th century. There's a reason why there's a lot of Ravens fans around here, you know, as opposed to Eagles fans and that sort of thing.
I thought it was just poor taste is prevalent in this area.
No comment. As a part-time resident, no comment. You know, so those things are happening, but in these road networks that I mentioned, all these little roads, are part of something that is called the Great Wagon Road. And that starts moving from Philadelphia in the middle of the 18th century, and eventually it's going to mark an 800 or so mile path that will take folks from that major urban center on the east coast of Philadelphia to west through Lancaster, and Lancaster grows because it's on the road. York grows because it's on the road. It curves through Hanover. It curves through what will become Gettysburg, and that's why Samuel Geddes has a tavern here. It's a stop on the Great Wagon Road, and eventually that road will connect to Winchester, Virginia, via the Black Gap and Nichols Road that we talked about, and that's happening by 1754. So by 1754, we've got a gateway to the valley.
Huh.
And if you think, Winchester and its importance in the American Civil War,
Right.
specifically to the Gettysburg campaign, when Milroy gets whacked down there and the door is just kicked open for the invasion force and opening that whole channel for those guys to send supplies back, that's road networks that are all going to date back to the 18th century over there. So we're seeing a lot of travelers that are going to be coming through this area way back then, for sure.
So the roads are being used to reach. I guess they're getting resources from further places further west and bringing them east and south. Is that basically what you're saying?
So the great,
like, who's coming from the west? Where are they
right.
coming from and why?
So from the west,
yeah,
you're expanding.
So you're going out.
You're going out to the west
to gather or to build.
To build. To build society out there. This becomes very attractive farmland for Germanic families during the 18th century.
Why the Germans?
The Germans are escaping poverty, just like a lot of other people. And I think we have to remember Germany's not unified until Bismarck.
Right.
In the late 19th century, 1870 or 1871. So before that time, Germany is really a collection of small states and principalities and duchies, and they've all 60. Pennsylvania will see a huge influx of Germanic immigration. And the land here that those folks encounter is very similar to what you would see in Germany, the Rhine and Ruhr River Valley farming regions. It feels comfortable. There are other, and it's one of those things, as immigrant communities build, you find people who culturally and socially can relate to you.
Yeah.
And you go there, and the Germans do tend to cluster together. Just like anybody else, though, they've got their own sort of differences in different sects. The Anabaptists, like the Mennonites, are very different from Reformed Lutherans who are going to be settling. So they have their own different types of communities. But by and large, they're coming here to escape poverty. But in this area, in this region of what will become Gettysburg, you also have tons of Scotch-Irish Presbyterian as well, who are forming their own communities. Farming, for sure, is one of the biggest professions in the area in the 18th century. And, you asked about what's going east. Mm-hmm. Well, the stuff that's going east is wheat.
Okay.
Lots of grain production during the American Revolutionary period and through the war. York, Chester, if you went west to east, York, Lancaster, Chester counties are massive centers of grain production. There are some estimates that the grain coming out of that region, those three counties, is enough to make bread for close to 250,000 people a year.
Wow.
So there's huge centers of grain production. Now, they're going to diversify crops over time. There are things that happen with wheat prices and crop failures in the 18th century where they diversify, but wheat is one of the chief products that's coming out of here. It's almost like a mini export system within the colony, because that's where it's going to come from.
The German POWs that were held here that decided to stay, one of the things they say is that it reminded them of home.
Yeah. Can we talk about them a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah, because I want to do a little myth busting for some of our listeners. Not Tim Smith style.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So with malice.
No, not with malice. And I would never claim Tim's mantle. Because the next time I see him, he may look at me askance.
Right.
Right. So, commonly we hear the word Hessians.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And everybody sort of lumps these guys in as Hessians.
Cool.
Right.
Right.
There you go. Yeah. But they're not all Hessians, and that's a myth, and they're not mercenaries. So, Germany being poverty-ridden, one of the other escape routes for a lot of guys is they're going to serve in the military. And at least that's going to give them some pay. At least it's going to give them meals. So they're going to take that as a course of action. In the Germanic states, it was really common to rent out armies in the 18th century for military conflicts. That's how Germanic princes were sort of adding to the state coffers by doing that. And for the Germanic troops, and I'm going to call them Germanic or German auxiliaries who fight in the American Revolution, that's what's happening here. These aren't mercenaries in a modern sense where it's like, yeah, I'm going to go fight over in this foreign land and you're going to give me a fat paycheck to do it, and I'll risk my life for that. Mm-hmm. For the German auxiliaries that are here, they're earning no more than their standard pay
Okay.
that they would.
Okay.
It's a series of contracts that the British Crown is going to work out with 6 different Germanic princes to have a total of about 30,000 troops fight alongside Crown forces during the course of the war. The largest contingency of those troops will come from the provinces of Hesse-Kassel. There are also troops that come from Braunschweig, Ansbach-Bayreuth, Waldeck, and Anhalt-Zerbst to lesser degrees.
So Hessian is easier to say.
Hessian is eessier to say, and they
For
all
us.
sort of get lumped in.
Yeah.
But there are these guys from these other places, and they would not have considered themselves Hessians. You know, Braunschweigers are not Hessians,
Right.
to be certain. And if we think a little bit about how those contracts work, and keep in mind too that the crown in England, it's a German family. Right.
Right. Right.
So, he's
Hanoverians?
They're Hanoverians. George III is an elector of Hanover in addition to being the king of Britain at that point in time. So there are connections that they've got there already politically, culturally. I mean, to this day, they are a Germanic family.
Yeah.
House of Windsor
Yeah,
was
right.
Saxe-Coburg-Gotha.
Right,
It was changed in World War I because that wasn't going to be real popular, to say those sorts of things. But
how does that happen, though?
what, changing a name?
No. How does that happen where you're Britain,
Right.
and your king is German,
Yeah. So let's
you're not Germany?
Yep. Let's take that
Or-
side street for a minute. So
Yeah.
basically, there is a very complicated right of succession for who gets the crown next when there's no immediate male heir. It's kind of like, over here, if something were to happen to the president of the United States, it's like, oh, vice president,
Right.
speaker of the House, et cetera, et cetera. Like, well, by the time you get to the postmaster general, like, you know what I mean?
Things are bad.
Things are bad.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's sort of what's happening in Britain in the 18th century when George I, who's the first Hanoverian king, they're trying to find somebody, and like they keep running into Catholics on the line.
Oh, that you can't.
And
you
they
can't do that.
They can't have a Catholic.
Get away
because
from the Catholics.
They can't have they hate the Catholics.
Yeah.
They can't have a Catholic because the king or queen of England is not just the head of state but also the head of church.
Mm-hmm.
It's the equivalency of the Pope. Right. So they can't have a Catholic there. So by the time they get to a good Protestant, it happens to be the guy who is George I from Hanover. And this is, early 18th century. George I is rarely in England, never learns to speak English. George II is going to speak broken English with a German accent. By the time you get to George III, the third of the Hanoverian line to be serving, he's the first one of the Hanoverian line that's actually going to stay. Like he's born there, he understands English, he speaks English as you would expect without an accent of sorts, that sort of thing. So that's why it's this complicated line of succession that they're working through to see like what interconnected household have we got. And you remember in the 18th century, all of these families in Europe, these thrones, there's a lot of times where they're intermarrying, sticking people in different places to try to create alliances, to try to do all kinds of stuff. But that's the short version of how that happens. But with the contracts that I was talking about, and this is sort of where, like, I think the myth of blood money has an origin. There's a set price that each German prince will charge. So, for example, giving you X number of troops, this is your rental fee.
Mm-hmm.
And the blood money comes in as, well, if somebody gets killed, then you owe us X amount of money. And if somebody is maimed, this amount of money. It almost reads like, it's a rough correlation, an accidental death and dismemberment policy.
Yeah, it's
exactly what it sounds like.
Right.
But that's where that's all coming from. But yeah, a lot of the prisoners from the German auxiliary forces who are in America will stay here because why the hell would they go back?
Sure. Now, what happens in that case if they stay and they're no longer of use to the prince?
Right. So
does Britain have to pay for them? Like, or does Britain say, oh, they're missing? And then it's like a wash.
That's unclear. Yeah.
Okay.
It is really unclear what happens with that and how they broker those sorts of things. So I don't have a good answer for you, but more research may be needed on that front.
All right. All right. So then let's, we're spending a lot of time before we even get to Gettysburg, really.
Yeah.
So let's get to Gettysburg now.
Right.
During the Revolution.
Yeah, wagon road to be sure. And we talked a little bit about taverns. The one other thing that I'll say about taverns is those are the focal points of society here, much like they are anywhere else.
Yeah.
So for the Samuel Geddes Tavern or for the Black Horse Tavern, which is on Marsh Creek, that's where you're going to get your news.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just where you're going to meet a friend. It's not where you're going to have a pint of ale or to have some spirituous liquors. That's how you're getting the news of the day, whether it's coming in through newspapers, whether it's coming in through gossip, whether in the 1770s that's coming in through committees of correspondence in the colonies, which are reporting back on these bubbling crises that are occurring in the 1760s and into the mid 1770s. So that's a real focal point. If you're thinking about population, in 1775, York County only has about 5,000 people total. All of York County. So it's a small place. You know, by 1863, Gettysburg's got just about 2,400 people.
Now, during that time, maybe like a little before let's say in the 1760s,
Mm-hmm.
what is the situation with the natives
Right.
here in Gettysburg,
Mm-hmm.
in this area?
Yeah, they are largely west by that point in time. One of the things,
And we're saying west, are we talking
We're
just
talking
in the
like-
mountains, or are we talking way past?
way past at that point in time. The last serious sort of interplays that you're going to see probably happened during the French Indian War in the 1750s. And Mary Jemison
Yeah.
is famously, kidnapped and taken by natives right near Route 30 west of town here as you're moving further out. But by the 1760s, there does not seem to be interplay, when it certainly is happening in the 1750s. Part of that has to do with, I said, 1763, that whole thing. One of the things that's really angering the colonists is the proclamation of 1763, which draws a dividing line near the Allegheny Mountains and says you can't go further west than this.
Right.
So by and large,
Don't tell an American he can't.
yeah, right.
Right.
And that's a big part of the problem. So by and large, you're looking at a very Anglo population. There probably are some slaves in the area in the 1770s, but by the time you get to the 1860s, there are no slaves listed on the censuses in Pennsylvania because of the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1780. Had really slowly, very slowly, worked to eradicate slavery, and that took 70 years or better for that to happen in Pennsylvania. So you're not seeing enslaved individuals. In the 1860s, you probably are encountering a handful of them in the 1770s. And interestingly, with the Gradual Emancipation Act of Pennsylvania in 1780, that is the first such act that is put out by a state. When you see opposition to it, the opposition is largely coming from German farm bases in the rural areas of Pennsylvania, because they are afraid that if slaves are freed, it is going to create competition for jobs.
That sounds familiar.
Sounds real familiar to
Yeah.
the 1860s,
Yeah, it
doesn't
does,
it?
yeah.
Yep. It's weird how history, if it doesn't repeat,
Right.
it reverberates.
Yeah.
For damn sure. Yeah.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
So the Germans aren't too keen on that.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm starting to understand the German attitude a little more, like the way some of the, like I was saying before the show, some of the quirkiness of the area.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to get it because it's such a deep German history here. Nothing against the Germans, but it's just they have a different way of looking at things.
The insular
Yeah,
and distrustful of outsiders.
right. And they
But-
love money.
They do. Very bent on profit. And they're not the only ones who are doing that. I mean, Quakers in the Philadelphia region, despite the fact that they dress plainly, they have a set of beliefs that is about pacifism. They're not afraid of making profit. And in many instances in the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1780, Quakers are very reluctant to release slaves and will go to great extents to try to maintain their slaves. One of the things that act called for was the registration of every slave with the state of Pennsylvania, so that they knew who these people were, because it started a clock. And it wasn't a free ticket, Matt. It was sort of like, this happens in 1780. If you had a child who was born into slavery 2 days before the act took effect, well, they were out of luck until they were 28 years old. Like, a clock ran for 28
Right.
years. And for people who were still enslaved, as long as they were registered, well, they could be bought and sold within the state of Pennsylvania. And then so you have people avoiding registrations in the hopes of maintaining these things longer, running clocks. And laws eventually have to get tightened over time. But there's a reason why it takes so long for that Emancipation Act to actually eradicate slavery.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So when the war begins, what... I mean, there must be volunteers from this area that go and join, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Pennsylvania, though, I know, put it like, let me ask you this way. All of the colonies that fought for the Continental Army, which state sent the most troops?
Pennsylvania and Virginia are two of the largest.
Okay.
It's hard to give you a definitive answer because records are fragmentary in many instances. And the Continental Army itself, it's just so much smaller than what we deal with in the Civil War time period. When you're dealing with the Union Army of 93,000 or something during the Battle of Gettysburg, the largest the Continental Army ever is for a single campaign is somewhere between 20 to 25,000 men.
Yeah, it's just hard to imagine when you deal with the Civil War numbers or World War II numbers or to think that that's called an army.
Right.
But I guess if it's all you got, then it's your army, right?
Where it's it's a corps, compared to what the Confederates are throwing out at Gettysburg.
Right.
We estimate, and again, these estimates are kind of rough, but maybe 230 to 250,000 individuals served in the Continental Army. And in addition to that, if you were to look at state militias, local militias, or emergency levy troops during the course of the American Revolution, somewhere between 150 to 165,000 other guys over the course of the 8 years served in those forces. But the biggest population states like Pennsylvania, like Virginia, like New York, are going to be the ones that over time end up contributing the most men to military service. The Gettysburg, what will become Gettysburg area, is no exception. Very early on in the conflict, there are folks who are enlisting here and mustering. And even before that, you see political action that's happening. And it's all centered around Samuel Gettys's Tavern. It really is. There was a meeting there in 1775, in April of that year, where a meeting of citizens decides to collect 250 pounds sterling in cash and to send that to the relief of the citizens of Boston. And the reason they're doing that is because, as put together, that ends up being called the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts in 1774, based on all the troubles that have been happening in the 1760s with things like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Act, repeated, protests in New England, specifically Massachusetts, against these various levels of direct and indirect taxation that they saw as abridgments of rights. Finally, the Crown gets pissed off enough to say, we're shutting the port of Boston. And that had a huge coalescing impact on the people. If you want to look at rebellion or revolution and it actually taking seed, you need the elites to be angry. You need the masses to be angry. You need people to believe that their political rights have been degraded. And they all have to look at each other and go, you know what? I think we can be friends over a couple of things just long enough to create a lot of havoc.
Right.
So it's a unique set of circumstances, but it's one that Britain creates in the 1760s over time. But when you get to those, what are called the Intolerable Acts, two phases of that. One is, and I'll get to the shutting of the port of Boston in a second, the Quebec Act in 1774. So remember, in that French Indian War, France is, the antagonist. That's who we're fighting against. And, now Canada is going to be a British possession, and the French colonists there are going to be subjugated. But in 1774, as part of these acts that are known as the Intolerable Acts, Parliament says, you know what? We're going to reinstate French civil law. We're Catholics, you're cool. You can hold public office. Don't worry about it. You guys want to start moving south into the Ohio River Valley? Sure, go ahead. And the colonists, wait a minute. The Ohio River Valley, what are you talking about? Do you not remember what we just fought for? Or are you just going to just ignore all that bloodshed, all that toil? That's for us. It's not for the French. What do you mean you're going to reinstate French civil law up there in private cases where, Catholicism's okay up there?
Right.
They're angry about that. And when you port it with the Port of Boston being shuttered, the best way that I can correlate that as an analogy is if you were to think of a major urban population center in the United States of America today that had been experiencing civil unrest, and the federal government's response suddenly to that was, we're shutting off all your road access, we're shutting your rail access, your airports are now closed, you get no imports coming in, we're taking control of all of your government and supplanting federal officials, and you'll get the supplies we give you.
Almost sounds familiar.
Mm-hmm. It's like they're starving women and children.
Yeah.
And when the colonists see that happen, and at the same time, Massachusetts' charter is abolished, and the crown steps in and appoints a government on its behalf, that's a coalescing moment for the other colonies, because they say, you know what? If that can happen there,
right,
that can happen to me, and that's not going to happen.
Right.
So that's why these relief funds for the poor women and children and families of Boston that they're gonna send up there. And all of our original, what we say our original 13 are going to participate.
Now, why do you say that? You've done this a couple times where you're like so-called original 13, or what we say original 13. What are you getting at?
I'm glad you asked that question, man, because it's one of those things where we try to simplify history. And it's like, okay, there's 13, great, they were all unified, we did it together. Well, it's like, hold on a minute, there's more than 13 British colonies in North America in 1775, because you have East and West Florida. And you've got Canada. You've got British Canada.
But East and West Florida are British at this point?
They are, because they become British possessions after the French and Indian War. We get those from Spain.
Okay.
So, but the people who are British colonists in Canada are outnumbered. It's fairly rural. It's cold as all get out. They're relying upon the crown to survive. And if you went down to Florida, it's a wasted swamp.
Right.
They're surrounded by non-friendly natives, Spanish-speaking individuals. They're who are not friendly to the Anglos there. They're dependent upon the crown.
So they're not really stable enough.
No way. But it's just like, I think it but I'm a fan of, like, look, history's always messy. Like, let's acknowledge the messiness of, yes, these 13 colonies ended up pulling together, but there are these British possessions in those other places who said, no, there's no way we could ever get involved with that sort of thing. But, yes, there's recruiting right away. June of 1775, again at Samuel Geddes' tavern. Captain Michael Doodle, who's coming out of York, Pennsylvania, comes to recruit a company of riflemen there. And that was in response to an initial call from the Continental Congress for Pennsylvania to provide what would become 8 companies of riflemen for service in the Continental Army. They're going to be enlisting for a period of a year. There's a lot of legend surrounding what happens there that day. Like, you see things like, Doodle was requiring guys to shoot at a mark of a nose outlined in chalk from 150 yards away, et cetera, to prove their prowess. That's not documented. Is it possible, feasible? Sure. We don't know if that happens. But he is going to recruit a company there, and they are going to report to Boston to serve with Washington. And then more men will be recruited here in the area as well, inclusive of James Geddes. Most of those guys who enlist in Doodle's company, who are only there for a year, and this is because the Continental Army for 75 and 76, the Congress will only authorize 1-year enlistments. They're petrified that a standing army, or an army that's going to be around for more than 1 year, would infringe on Republican virtues of people and take them away from their families. But they're also afraid of a military coup. The founders are students of history. Recent history and ancient history. And so they look to Roman republics a lot and go, oh man, militaries, they always have a coup. The civilian government gets overthrown. They're petrified of that. But you've got Washington early on saying, I need these guys for more than a year. It's going to take a year to make an army, to train an army, to do something with it. I get these guys halfway useful, and then they get to go home. I can't deal with it. So early enlistments, 75, 76, they're only 1-year enlistments. Many of the men who are going to enlist in Doodle's company will re-enlist over time. They become part of the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment, and we actually have a description of what these guys looked like that comes from Dr. James Thatcher. James Thatcher is a doctor from Barnstable, Massachusetts, and he is observing these Pennsylvanians when they get up to Massachusetts in 1775. And I'll just read this to you briefly. Thatcher says they are remarkably stout and hardy men, many of them exceeding 6 feet in height. They are dressed in frocks or rifle shirts and round hats. Their men are remarkable for the accuracy of their aim, striking a mark with great certainty at 200 yards distance. At a review, a company of them, while on a quick advance, fired their balls into objects of 7 inches diameter at the distance of 250 yards. Their shot frequently proved fatal to British officers and soldiers who exposed themselves. So, and the 1st Pennsylvania goes on to fight in famous battles like the New York Campaign, Trenton, Princeton, Germantown, Monmouth, Springfield, New Jersey in 1780, and that regiment will be mustered out at Philadelphia on June 11th of 1783. They have a lineage to this day within the Army National Guard. Company C of the 337th Engineer Battalion, 55th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade, 28th Infantry Division will claim lineage from Captain Michael Doodle's company of York. So that's the regiment that guys are going to be enlisting in early and then moving into sort of multiple enlistments. And I can talk a little bit about James Gettys's experience if you wish.
Yeah.
So Gettys is going to be one of those early enlistment folks, and he's going to be sent up to New York. And according to the research that has been done by Melissa Gettys, not a relation, and Amanda Howlett, he is going to be a sergeant, and he is going to serve in the New York campaign in 1776. The New York campaign of 1776 is the moment in time when the British Crown says, cut the crap. We're ending this. This is not going to go on. We're going to bring a hammer on an anvil hard and fast, and we're going to end this rebellion. They had left Boston, and New York is their next focus, and little side street. If you think about main British goals during the course of this war, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Savannah, St. Augustine, Mobile Bay, Providence, they're all ports. Mm-hmm. And there's 2 reasons for that. Number one is Britain, with a strong Navy mobilizing over 70 warships when conflict breaks out and we've got no Navy whatsoever, they can use that strong Navy to strangle local economies.
Sure.
Right. The other thing that was human, for me, history is about the people, right? And you can't, it's people like us making decisions a long time ago about their lives. So you have basic human needs. You need to eat. You need a place to go to the bathroom. You know, you might need medical attention. You need clothing. Well, the British Army could range from 8 to 30,000 guys at any given campaign, and they're going to be in the field for 6 to 8 months at a time, meaning they need millions of tons of supplies just to feed the human machine, right?
Right.
So those supplies aren't going to come from the American interior.
And the animal machine.
The animal machine too.
Yeah.
Right? And of course.
Keeps the army moving.
Keeps the army moving, you know? So port cities are important, but New York... it's the largest fleet the world has seen since the Spanish Army.
Now, where is? I mean, it must be locally that the British are supplying themselves by or from, right? I mean, they can't be getting supplies. I'm talking grain and stuff like that.
Right.
That can't be coming from England. What is it? No. The Caribbean or
they have supplies, different supplies coming from different places. They have supplies coming from Halifax.
Okay.
They have supplies coming from the West Indies. They have supplies coming from the home islands. But frequently grain is something that is in short supply. It's not something that transports well by sea a lot of times.
Right.
So granaries are things that are being plundered consistently from the local population when they are there. They are getting an extent shipped, but you need a lot. I mean, you think about, 10, 14 pounds of hay and oats a day for a horse or a mule, something along those lines. They require a lot of fodder.
Do you ever see, well, I mean, there's a lot of movies that depict warfare with the British Army back in that era. But I'm always comically struck by the fine array of silverware and everything, a dining accoutrement that the British officers carry with them into the depths of hell. Right. I mean, they're in the American frontier, or I've been watching the show called The Terror. Did you ever see that on A&E?
No.
Or not A&E, AMC.
Mm-mm.
It's based on the Franklin expedition. It's a horror show. It's fiction. Like there's some supernatural element, but they pay good attention to, well, I think British. and they have some historical accuracy to certain parts of it. But one of the things is like when they leave the ships and try to find land and go on foot, they're making camp, and the officers have all this nice. I'm thinking to myself, like, you're dying of lead poisoning. You're dragging the lifeboats on sleds across rocks and stuff. And, you could make a much lighter load if you just lived in a pup tent like everybody else, but you're bringing all the silverware.
It depends. It really depends upon the officer. It depends upon the campaign. I mean, famously, during the Saratoga campaign in 1777, General John Burgoyne has wagon loads of personal baggage.
Right.
But, he's not schlepping that. Somebody else is going to schlep those things.
That's my point. It's such a waste.
It is. It's a different age. I mean, I think Burgoyne is sort of he's probably an example on an end of the spectrum, right? I mean, he's the guy who's doing it to the hilt.
Right.
But, Washington doesn't travel light either.
No, yeah. But that's my point, though, is that, like, the British are the extreme example, but I know Washington's doing the same thing, too. And I get that it's that era. It's like I guess it's the aristocracy or something. Like, there's that mindset that they have. It just seems to me like there had to be some point where they go, guys, this isn't practical to carry all this shit with us when we're out in the middle of nowhere. Like, we're on the frontier or wherever, whatever the case may be. Like, there had to be some point where they did away with that.
There are in certain campaigns, if you looked at Sullivan's campaign in 1779, which is expressly fast-moving and designed to just utterly obliterate native villages. Officers on that campaign are not carrying that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They're traveling light and fast. Over time, I think the ephemera that officers carry is going to be lessened. They'll learn that. But, it changes. If you're moving on a campaign that's fast, you might not carry much. But if they know they're going into a situation where they're in quarters in a static location, like they usually are in winters, they'll have baggage sent in and comforts from home. Things will be sent back. But I think when you see a lot of that
I'll give them that.
Yeah, the baggage and the big stuff, that is more general officers. When you drill down into field grade or line officers, you would see a lot of accounts of those guys not having all that stuff.
Okay.
I've read plenty of accounts of sort of captains and lieutenants, on a campaign, like, well, I've slept under a tree this night, or, major so-and-so.
Usually it's like
there.
colonels and up that are depicted this way.
Yeah. And to an extent it's accurate. I think it's like anything else we see on TV. It's like, you got to take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
And then you got to move from there. But it does become a complicated and complex question. But also many officers of the time period, they're coming from social stratospheres that are higher in the Continental Army and the British Army. The British Army, it's an aristocratic set to begin with. Commissions are bought and sold in the British Army, in addition to having military training. And they're buying and selling commissions because that's part of their retirement package there, right? So in the American Army, when you're recruiting from local level communities. So, you've got a local citizen who's prominent. Well, if he can get 100 guys maybe you're going to get a commission as a captain. Those guys are coming from positions where they're already doctors, lawyers, legislators, wealthy merchants, that sort of thing. So, and the officers having to pay for their own arms and equipment, they're going to reflect that in many ways. But the New York campaign, when I said like hammer on the anvil, the British assemble. Now, mind you, Washington's army of 18 to 20,000, largely untested, poorly trained. He has no navy. He's going to defend a series of islands. So to counter that, the British assemble the largest fleet the world has seen since the Spanish Armada. It is Britain's largest military amphibious operation until they assault the Dardanelles in the First World War. 30,000 troops, hundreds of ships when you look at not just warships, but transports, tenders, that sort of thing. And they're going to assault New York, and they're going to start onto Long Island. And that's where a lot of these guys from the area that will eventually become Gettysburg and Adams County are going to see combat there. Heavy combat for the first time. And the really short version of what happens on Long Island is that these men are among troops who are going to defend the Gowanus Heights. And just like we have mountain passes out here in Gettysburg, there are mountain passes on the passes on the Gowanus Heights. They're not really mountains. But, the Jamaica Pass is left unguarded. It's slipped up. So what the British do is They go through the Jamaica Pass, they get into the American rear, and these guys are just squashed. And it's horrific. And they don't tell us, what those intricacies of combat are like, but it has to be sheer terror. When they see on all sides of them, they're just being pressed by British or by, these Germanic auxiliaries or Hessians, if people are going to call them Hessians, and they're trying to get out.
Yeah.
And, they smell things like sulfur, burning flesh, burning hair. They hear the screams of the wounded. They encounter sights that they never, ever could have imagined because they have no idea what they're getting into, and they need to escape. And when they try to escape, a lot of it is through the Gowanus marshes. And a lot of these guys can't swim. And they're struggling to get through this muddy terrain, or they're drowning in the Gowanus. And, if they're being taken up by the British, a lot of times they're being rounded up as prisoners of war. Unfortunately, for a lot of these guys that are going to encounter the Germanic auxiliaries, they're just going to be slaughtered. And that's because the Germanic auxiliaries had been told, the Americans will show you no mercy.
Oh.
The Americans, the riflemen particularly, will show you no mercy. They will kill you. So when the Hessians encounter them, there are plenty of accounts of guys being bayoneted to trees, guys trying to surrender and being bayoneted in the chest, being left in the marshes. It's absolutely horrific.
Right. We don't think of that when we think of the Revolution, right? You don't hear those stories like you do in the Civil War.
It's not a gentlemanly age. I mean, warfare is never really a gentlemanly affair. I mean, all the horrors are present. I mean, Fran Fayoc did a great job describing things, sights, sounds, smells, what these guys are hearing. One of your recent episodes, I couldn't do it any better than Fran did, but I think if people listen to that, they could apply that to the Rev War.
Yeah, you're talking about the July 3rd anniversary episode where he's talking about, I love what he did there.
Yeah.
I think that made the whole effort really, is him doing it that way. It was fantastic.
Yep.
But no, it's true. Like there's a lot that goes through it. I mean, there's lead and iron flying through the air. What is it going to be but horrific? Right. I was talking to some weapons that are designed to make it a little cleaner and neater, and it's still horrible. And I go, well, of course it is. It's like destruction of life. Like it's I don't care. You can't make it nice.
Right.
That's
and, and I think for a lot of us of the permanently 39 age, the war movies we grew up watching,
sanitized a lot.
Sanitized everything.
Until Private Ryan.
Until Saving Private Ryan, which was the first time I ever went to a movie and the theater was just silent when we left. And
there were 5 of us. Me and my one other friend were the only ones who weren't on the high school football team. This was 2 years, I think, or a year or two after we graduated. When did that come out? 97?
Yeah.
All right, so it was a year after we graduated. And we were all like gung ho. Yeah, it's been a while since there was a good World War II movie. We're going all excited to go in there, and none of us could speak or look at each other afterwards and we all admitted later that we were ready to cry. Even the football players, who really are the biggest wimps anyway. But but no, really, I mean, that movie was the first one. Almost like it just. You know what it was? What was it for you that really got you? Like that really drilled home to you that
in
this
that movie?
What was it about Private Ryan that really drilled home to you that war is not a John Wayne movie?
Yeah, I think there's that whole scene when they're coming off the landing craft and that he's just sitting there with his entrails hanging out, holding on to a rosary, asking for his mother. I mean, how could you? And it's like, it's like you almost don't know how to process it. You don't know how to think about it. And then you go, holy shit. Like, and if, for folks who had family in World War II or growing up around veterans, like you look at those guys after that movie and go, man, that's what they saw. Or guys that I would know later in life when, I was Civil War reenacting, but not only that, Sons of Union veterans of the Civil War. So we were doing a lot of stuff with Memorial Day cleanup, cemetery decorations. We had a couple of guys in our son's camp who were World War II veterans.
Yeah.
And one of them was Beach Battalion. And he survived Normandy and then went to the Pacific to go clear obstacles and came out without a scratch.
Really?
So, like I'd seen the movie before I met these guys, but then like they would tell you, yeah, I was here. I roughly did this. And then I'm thinking to myself, my God, that's what Harry was like. How is Harry adjusted to society?
Right.
And or my other dear friend, both since deceased, Bud Atkinson. And Bud was 6'4" in his 80s and drove a tank,
Really?
in the Ardennes. And I said,
How'd he fit?
I said, well, that's what I said. I said, Bud, the first time he told me he did, he was like, Bud, how'd you fit in the tank? And he looks at me and goes, kid. Everybody was kid, of course.
Right, of course.
Kid, I ripped out the effing seat, and that's how I got there. But, even for those guys, when they'd have a moment after a few beers, you'd get a small taste. And it was nothing you ever asked for. But when they were willing to share, you appreciated that moment, and you almost didn't know what to do. And I think the only effective response was just to listen. I'll never forget one time, we're sitting at the Eisenhower. It was Remembrance Day weekend. Somebody brought up the topic of dogs. And Bud said, I don't like dogs. I said, okay. So, well, that's cool. Some people like cats. And I said, why? And he looked at me and he said, when I was over there, the effing Germans were strapping grenades to him and smacking him on the ass and sending him into our lines in the middle of the night. And that was it. Yeah. And it was just, well, what do you say?
Yeah.
I mean, you're grateful that they shared that moment because they've come to this catharsis period where they feel comfortable sharing with you, but it is a civilian who's never experienced combat or was not in that situation. Horror takes on so many different shapes that you just never could have imagined.
No.
Who imagines the dog being used as like a weapon like that?
I would have said I don't like Germans after experiencing that.
So, but
you know what? But so, okay, that was a good answer, the entrails and everything, but I had seen gory war movies before.
Right.
And they hadn't had the effect on me that Private Ryan did. You know what did? The surround sound. And I could hear a bullet whiz past my ear and thwap into a piece of metal or the ground behind me or body. And they did such great work with the sound design that Normandy scene put me, for the first time ever seeing a war movie, put me in the middle of the battle because I was literally surrounded by the bullets whizzing past their heads. And it scared the shit out of me. Like it terrified me. And from that moment on, I started to look at warfare and the military with a different reverence than I did before. And I don't, to this day, like I love talking to combat veterans because I don't understand, like you said, how do you come back and function in society? I couldn't do it. I mean, took me a couple days to get over Saving Private Ryan, and it was a movie. Yeah,
your theaters in North Jersey must have been a little bit more advanced.
Yes.
I don't remember seeing it in surround sound.
Oh, we had it in surround. It was. I think it was the first movie I ever saw in surround sound because it was. Or if I had seen movies in surround sound before, they weren't movies where you really needed it.
Right.
So it didn't click with me. But this movie, it totally clicked with me because I remember the first time I heard a thing and it hit a piece of metal, I looked behind me because I'm like, what the hell was that? And then I realized, oh, this is surround sound, what they call surround sound, so-called surround sound. All right, so let's get back to the revolution.
And so you can translate that, I think, to any battlefield in different uniforms.
Yes, that's the point we're trying to make.
It is the point. And and I would say too, for the enthusiasts who study strategy and movement of people, in battles, when we look at things, remember that it's not that red block or that blue block.
Yeah.
Right? That you see moving on the animated map. There's hundreds of thousands of guys in there, just like you, with hopes, dreams, fears, etc. Going into what may be the very end. So for James Geddes, though, at New York, documentation, again, shocking, scant in the 18th century, but he is listed as missing after the Battle of Long Island. And the assumption is that he is taken prisoner because he is missing for a short period of time.
Okay.
What his experience was as a prisoner after Long Island could have varied very greatly. He doesn't leave anything back about this. And the reason I think that Geddes is not Remember I said before, like a lot of what we get is these pension applications, but there's no Pension Act until 1818 where they have to start proving their service and detailing things. The original Pension Act in 1818 was so restrictive. They just did not take good care of the veterans. First of all, you waited, 35 years until the war ends to form a Pension Act.
Right.
But when they do it in 1818, if you served in the militia or a months as well, I guess, and any clip shorter than that, you weren't going to be eligible, and you had to be in reduced circumstances. So Geddes is not in poverty. So why would he apply for a pension?
Yeah.
And you just can't assume, like, maybe that's stuff he didn't want to think about.
Right.
Maybe it's stuff he didn't want to write about. So, I mean, unfortunately, we have nothing from him. But the assumption is he's taken prisoner, and that could have varied greatly. There are accounts of some of these guys who were taken prisoner at Long Island, who, while foodstuffs are in short supply, they get a fairly decent amount of liberty to walk around Gravesend and places like that. For others who are taken prisoner, they suffer the horror of the sugar houses in New York. And those are places where hundreds of guys are shoved into buildings that should only fit 70 or 80.
Oh.
William Cunningham, who was overseeing the prisons in New York.
What were they, like sugar warehouses? Why are they called sugar houses?
Yeah, they're sugar warehouses,
okay.
and it goes back to the rum and sugar trade with the West Indies.
Yeah,
Basically, these are confiscated structures that had belonged to men who, like the Livingston and Schuyler families.
Okay.
Big New York names who support the revolution. These properties are confiscated, everything's hauled out, and then the British use them as prisons. But they're jamming hundreds of guys into spaces that are designed for nowhere near that capacity. The supplies and the food that are coming through are scant at best. They'll start subsisting on things like shoe leather, rodents, and they're beaten, they're tortured. You think of Andersonville and Elmira, but worse.
Worse, yeah.
But worse.
Yeah.
And the guy who's running those prisons for the British, William Cunningham, by all accounts, was a noted sadist. He was in Philadelphia in 1777 when the British occupied the city there, overseeing the American prisoners of war. And he would do things to be intentionally cruel. There's accounts of a guy making a stew out of shoe leather and rat.
Ugh.
And Cunningham coming in to the prison cell, looking at it and accidentally kicking it over.
Oh.
We're saying, well, you shouldn't be eating that.
Oh, it's not good for you.
And dumping it and throwing it out. Or beating guys with keys, things of that nature.
With keys?
With iron keys.
Like a whole ring of them?
Mm-hmm. Using that like a little cat o' nine tails.
Yeah.
So what Geddes experienced as a prisoner, it's hard to say. There are other men in that company he's serving with that are, local names like McPherson and Spangler, who were also up there with him. But we do know about Geddes is that he does come back home by 1781. He has enlisted in a volunteer dragoon unit, and he has made a cornet, which is sort of a second lieutenant equivalency in a cavalry unit during the 18th century. And those guys are being held in readiness in 1781 because you've got armies moving south in what will eventually become the Yorktown campaign.
Okay.
And they're being held in readiness here locally, but they're not going to see combat at that point in time. But 1781, that's his last bit of service during the Revolutionary War. While he's doing that, Anthony Wayne is moving with a portion of the American army west. They get as far as Littlestown before they turn, and they're going to join up with the Marquis de Lafayette in Virginia, because in 1780-81, British incursions are starting to move north. But before Cornwallis gets to Yorktown, there's a British raiding force under Benedict Arnold that's moving through the state of Virginia.
Names it took to put John Wayne together. That's how John Wayne got his name.
Is it really? What was his real name?
Marion Michael Morrison.
That's it.
Could you imagine a tough guy named Marion?
No.
Yeah.
No, it sounds like he should be fronting a band.
Yeah. A British band.
Yeah, Marion Michael Morrison.
A British new wave band.
Right.
No, it was John Wayne. It was like one of the, I forget, it was some Hollywood muckety muck, Matt Anthony Wayne and John. Those are two, really American sounding names. Let's put them together, John Wayne, and that was how he got the name.
Well, there you go.
Was it Matt Anthony? Was that his nickname, Matt Anthony?
His nickname is Matt Anthony,
yeah.
And the that's one of those weird things that's shrouded in mystery too. He was not a capricious guy. He wasn't insane.
He was just angry and
He
they
had a
misunderstand
temper,
it.
he had a temper from time to time.
Okay.
But there's no good documentation. Like, there's nobody out here who says, yes, I called him Mad Anthony Wayne on this day for this reason, and thus and thenceforth it shall ever be. You wish you had it, but, that's his... But he's an interesting guy. After the war is over, most of the general officers in the Continental Army will go back to being merchants or politicians or, or these other things they did in regular life. Wayne stays in and commands the Legion of the United States. He fights at Fallen Timbers in the 1790s, and he opens up, or he's responsible for helping to open up what becomes the Old Northwest Passage. He opens the Commerce Pass for what will become the states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois into the 19th century. And when Wayne dies... in the 1790s, he's serving at Fort Presque Isle, which is on the shores of Lake Erie.
Mm-hmm.
And it was thought that he was just going to be buried there until the family got that news and said, yeah, no, he's supposed to be buried at home at St. Peter's Episcopal in our family yard. And a compromise ends up getting struck between the family and the military. He was exhumed and his body was rendered.
It
was boiled. Yes, yeah. So the elements of protein that were sloughed off as part of that rendering process were buried at Presque Isle, and the bones are transported back into the area of Paoli.
No
Pennsylvania
kidding.
today. So he's legally buried in 2 spots.
Wow.
Yeah, which is kind of weird. But
That's disgusting.
It is disgusting, but doesn't it prove that, people are weird in every age,
Yeah, and that today we would consider ghoulish, but would that have been considered ghoulish back then?
I don't know. I do. I kind of think so. But it's hard
but
for me
you
to-
have modern sensibilities.
I do, but I've never run across many accounts of bodies being rendered.
No,
So-
that wasn't in some kind of sick, serial killer way.
No, and it's certainly not. It's not even an arcane 18th century mourning ritual,
Right?
Where they well, this weird thing must happen now,
Right, right.
So, but yeah. So that's Wayne. Other people who are supporting the revolutionary cause from this area are doing so in capacity that's not necessarily military. As I said, it's a major center of grain production. Alexander Dobbin, who built the Dobbin House, he's here in 1774. Of
Delicious.
course, it is delicious. Thank you, Jackie White, for that lovely place we can all go and visit. And thank you, Jackie White, for restoring that place. Lovely.
Yeah, really. Good job.
Yeah.
And thank you for the Of Flesh and Fish. It's my favorite.
Yeah. You're making me hungry, man.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm starving.
I know. We're gonna have to do dinner sometime.
Yeah, we will.
Anyway, so so when Dobbin gets here, and of course that's our oldest. For those who don't know, the Dobbin House is the only structure from the American Revolution within the current bounds of the borough of Gettysburg that relates to that time period.
Yeah,
1776. So it's his school for classical studies at the time. Between the 2 marriages, Dobbin ends up with 19 kids living in that house. But there is some things like supplying horses to the Continental Army.
Okay.
Grain is coming out of here for sure in this region, but those other industries that are making wagon parts and iron implements, they're supporting the Continental Army as well. So the local civilian base, those materials are being sent to the Continental Army, because the war itself, in terms of massive combat, doesn't touch Lancaster or York County. There's some things that pass through, but the war itself doesn't touch it. And then there was just a really cool pension application that I ran across at the Adams County Historical Society. So yeah, we've talked about how those pensions are kind of crazy, the way they develop a little bit, but in many times, if a veteran was deceased and a widow or a child was applying for the pension, you'd need witnesses to write affidavits, right? So this one guy, Thomas Rowan, is constructing this affidavit to help the family of Thomas Reed, who was born in 1755 near Fairfield, was captured at Long Island in 1776, was a prisoner for 9 months, fought at Brandywine, died in Gettysburg in 1812. So when Rowan is writing this application, he says, in the winter of 1777-78, when the American Army lay at Valley Forge, I was sent by my mother with what he calls a houseload of cheese.
Sounds delicious.
It sounds delightfully delicious.
Yeah.
I am perplexed and vexed. I couldn't tell you how much cheese it is.
Right.
But
it sounds like a lot. Yeah.
It's a house load.
I'm picturing big wheels.
Yeah.
Not like little bars, but like big wheels of cheese.
Yeah. When they cut out the center and then they heat it up and the pasta dips in there.
Yeah. The Parmesan.
Yeah, some veal cutlet. And,
God.
Chicken cutlet. Anyway.
Stop talking about the food. You're making me starving over here.
I know.
Come on.
Now I want mom's chicken cutlet. But anyway, so Rowan brings this house load of cheese to his brothers who are serving at the encampment. And he says, at that time, I actually saw Lieutenant Thomas Reed, who was at Valley Forge. So you get these little insights from the pension applications, but it was also just interesting to me that it talks about, like, that's a long haul to get from near Fairfield all the way out to Valley Forge. You're crossing the Susquehanna.
There's no turnpike. There's no any kind of highways like that. No pavement.
There's that Great Wagon Road, but that's it. But it's a long journey.
I don't like going from Fairfield to Gettysburg. It's like 20 minutes, and when I hit Fairfield, the town, because like if I'm coming from the other side of Fairfield, and I hit the town of Fairfield, and the cops, they just had a town meeting, and they're like, a lot of people were cracking down on speeding through town, and a lot of those people are coming from Gettysburg, so now they're like out there looking, and so you got to go slow, and it takes only 20 minutes, but I'm like, it's so exhausting. I need to take a nap when I get to Gettysburg. This kid's going all the way out to Valley Forge.
Weeks to get there.
Weeks with cheese.
Weeks with a house load of cheese.
You got to keep the cheese fresh. You got to make sure no bears are coming to eat it at night. What do you do with all that cheese when you're stopping?
We're cheese lovers.
Yeah.
Like a cheese mafia.
I mean, it depends on what kind of cheese it is, really.
That's true. If it's blue, I don't want it.
Oh, I love it. I'll take it.
Sorry. Well, you can have mine.
All right. Good.
Deal.
Good.
4 score it is. Another interesting just trivia piece. Well, more than a trivia piece, I think, anyway, for when we're looking at these pensions. So when I went to ACHS to do some research on guys from the area, pensions were what I wanted. So they gave me these stacks of files. And I started to look through the affidavits. Of course, the lawyer is going to be signing off on this. In 80% of the cases, it's David McConaughey. Same David McConaughey, who's on the board of directors of Evergreen, instrumental in preserving the battlefield. He is doing a ton of work with widows in the 1830s,
lawyer, young David McConaughey.
David McConaughey is at the forefront of trying to get these widows' pensions. And so that was interesting to me. And the sad thing, beyond the obvious sadness of they had a husband who was now gone.
Yeah.
They have to sign these pension affidavits, the applicants do.
Right.
And in the vast majority of cases, it was an ex.
Oh, really?
Which meant
this made their mark. They
could not write their name.
Huh.
And it was just one of those moments where it's like, there's a lot we take for granted right now. In 2024.
So I mean, even if the difference from the Revolutionary generation to the Civil War generation, literacy has gone up a lot. I mean, we have a lot of letters and diaries to read from the Civil War. Not so much, and maybe that's why.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Huh. So it's not like it's that long ago where they didn't keep records of things. I mean, we have records from thousands of years ago in the world. So
it's certainly not enough. And when you look at it in comparison to there's so much Civil War primary source material, just mountains of.
We get spoiled studying the Civil War.
We do. And as I was doing research for this program, I was like, man, my Civil War programs is so much easier. Of course, that's part of the challenge too with doing living history and reenacting in the 18th century is there's so few pieces of material culture that survive to study.
Right.
When we reconstruct uniforms and things like that by hand, it's harder because you're looking a lot of times at paintings or a few excellent examples of things. It just becomes more difficult. So for those guys who passed away, pensions, this is a good spot to say that there are at least 10 residents of what would become Gettysburg that are killed during the war. That list was put together by ACHS. It's available on their website. Graves of veterans can be found pretty easily in local cemeteries. If you want to just go take a walk through Evergreen, you're going to come across a lot of graves. Many of them are marked veteran of the Revolution. There are a small handful buried at Great Conewago Presbyterian Church out near Hunterstown.
Okay.
And the Old Marsh Creek Cemetery near the Black Horse Tavern, the one that's on the side of the road.
That tiny little cemetery there.
It's like there's nowhere to park because it's a drainage ditch on either side of the road. If you can find a place to park and walk down there, there are a couple of Revolutionary War veterans who are buried there, and that is also where Alexander Dobbin is buried.
Interesting. I didn't know that. He's buried there. Why? Okay, so I just assumed he was in Evergreen somewhere.
Yeah, the reason for that is that when he got here in 1774, he was responsible for a Presbyterian church that was like a mile north of town or so on Rock Creek.
Yeah.
So he was connected in with that, and that's why he went in there. And I guess, too, when Evergreen comes in the early 1850s, they just weren't exhuming that body.
Right.
So, but he's down at Lower Marsh Creek. Which I will lead me into a guy I want to talk about who's also a man of the cloth.
Okay.
Because when we talked earlier about it's always complicated, it's always messy, not everybody's unified. Like, hey, are there people who supported the crown from this area during the Revolution? Sure. And it's like, yep, they're out there. Thomas McKean, who was the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania in 1781, had a really famous quote that said, in the Revolution, Pennsylvania was not a nation at war with another nation, but a country in a state of civil war. And that's really accurate in a lot of ways.
Say that again, please.
Yep. Thomas McKean says...
Slowly, like I'm 5.
In 1781...
Yes.
Thomas McKean, Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, will say, quote, Pennsylvania was not a nation at war with another nation.
Right.
But a country
Gotcha.
in a state of civil war.
Got it.
So McKean's obviously doing that awesome, Revolutionary War period thing at war with Great Britain, as it is a country itself in a state of civil war.
Mm-hmm.
And
because not everybody is on the side of the colonists.
Nope. And the reasons for that can be a little varied. Pennsylvania is a proprietary colony, and it's owned by the Penn family prior to the Revolution. So when 1775 rolls around, we have the outbreak of rebellion. To my mind, it's not a revolution until we declare independence.
Right, okay.
That's a revolution at that stage. And when that happens and we say no more kings, then all the states have to scramble to form state governments because they're not colonies anymore. So Pennsylvania, radical set of politicians that hated the Penn family. And this is the opportunity. It's like, now the Penns are gone. They've been overthrown, and the radicals take charge of the Pennsylvania state government. They write a new constitution. It is very restrictive, and it sort of takes the hard line immediately of, if you're not with us, you're against us, which alienates Schwenkfelders, Mennonites, Quakers, people who, for religious purposes, are conscientious objectors that want to say, no, I'm not supporting anybody. I'm sorry.
Right.
No, I'm not doing it. But the state government goes, well, guess what? We're going to confiscate your property then.
Right.
Like,
yeah, I never understood people that when you say I'm not on either side, they go, well, you have to be. It's like, I don't get that.
Right.
Like,
doesn't it ring true to like now?
Well, that's what I'm saying is like now that's where I'm getting it from. Because now I say to people like, well, I'm not a member of either party. I think they're both insane. And they're like, well, that's nuts. You have to be a part of what you pick a side. I'm like, no, I think you're both nuts. No. Like, why am I going to do that? And I think it's because misery loves company.
Misery loves company. There was a lot of money to be made. There was a lot of revenge to be had. But for those people who refused to take an oath of loyalty, you had to sign it. Take an oath of loyalty during the course of the Revolution. So if you don't want to take it, then you can't vote. You can't hold political office. You can't buy or sell real estate. You can't serve as a juror. You can't sue for debt, and you are to be disarmed.
So you have no rights, basically.
Right. So to a lot of people, that sounds like, well, hold the phone here. Like, you're saying the British are tyrannical? What the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Just because I refuse to take a side here, you're going to strip away all my rights?
Right. As if I'm on the other side. Yeah.
Right. And so,
well, I think that's what they're saying. It's like, we're going to treat you like you're the enemy unless you come to our side.
Yep. And if they don't want to serve in the militia, then they will be fined £3, 10 shillings per person. There are 438 men from what will become Adams County who refuse to take the oath.
And, good for them.
And a lot of them are saying, like, this is the type of oppression that we left Germany because
Right.
of. This is the type of oppression that we left England because we were religious minorities.
But don't we also see that kind of with the Confederacy, is that as the war goes on, they realize they have to centralize certain powers in order to win the war. And then they're at like this, they're in this like existential crisis because it's like, well, we're supposed to be against that.
Right.
But we have to do it or we're going to lose.
Yeah.
And then the states are like, no, we're not. That's why we broke away from Washington. We're going to break away from you. Yeah. So like, even while you're at war with your enemy, you're at war within.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, Joseph Brown, governor of Georgia, famously says, like, no, I'm not giving stuff to other people.
Right.
I don't care how badly you need it. And then those uniforms,
are for our troops.
They sit there for decades, and then Japanese POWs wear those uniforms in World War II because he wouldn't give them to North Carolina.
I know, but I mean that's the point, is that there are people who are sticking to their beliefs no matter what.
Yeah, and it creates this really, really tense environment.
How many people would you say of the population, percentage wise, supported the revolution? I hear around 30%. What do you say to that?
It's probably the best estimate we're going to get, and that number comes from John Adams at the time.
So he would know better than we would,
I would
probably,
think so.
right?
Because we don't have the Gallup polls,
right?
Know what I mean? So unfortunately, when it's all over, like, hey, how was your experience in the revolution? Here's your exit poll, that sort of thing. So
if he hung out with 10 people, 3 of them were on the revolutionary side. So that's probably where he got that from. But it just goes to show you don't need 50% of any population for anything.
You just need a coalition of certain elites in the mass to affect change. But there's people who switch sides during the course of the revolution too. It's so messy in so many ways. Yeah. Joseph Galloway is a delegate to the First Continental Congress. He goes on to become a massive loyalist supporter. He's guiding Howe during the Philadelphia campaign against Continental forces. There's huge conflicted consciousness from people over here. As the war changes from rebellion to revolution, there are patriots who say, no, I'm out. I never wanted that.
Right.
You guys are insane.
Yeah.
You're on your own. Go take care of that sort of thing. There are folks who switch sides on both sides of the equation. And it bears mentioning that it's not just a conflicted thing here. In Britain, there is a hugely conflicted national consciousness over this military conflict.
Oh, interesting.
Because in we have Republicans and Democrats today. In Britain, Whigs and Tories are the main political party in the 18th century. Consistently, Whigs in Britain are saying, slow down on the Americans. Stop pushing them so hard on the Americans. We need those guys. We need that place. We're counting on that to be, again, the model of empirical economic success in the Western Hemisphere. Let's not tick them off too much. And when rebellion finally comes, the Whigs are pushing for easier approaches, political settlements. The Tories are war hawks saying, kill them now. And interestingly, the commanders of British forces early in the war, William Howe, who has the infantry, his brother Richard has the navy, they're both Whigs and sit in Parliament. And they understand that. It's like, and it's one of those things, like, you're fighting a war against people who largely share common beliefs, customs, culture, religion. They look like you. They sound like you. Like, we just fought a war together. Why are we fighting against each other now?
Right.
Like, sounds like Mexico in 1861. Like, there's these weird correlations. But, the Whig philosophy is reflective of the British national consciousness that's very conflicted. What changes the entire landscape of the war is going to be the entry of France.
Right.
Because when France enters, France is a traditional enemy of Britain. Unlike the Americans, France has a powerful army. France has a powerful navy. France has the ability to invade over the Channel. It's a short distance. They can threaten dominions in the West Indies, places like Guadeloupe, tiny island, but square inch per square inch, some of the most valuable real estate in the world because of the sugar trade, threaten dominion on the slave trade, western coast of Africa, threaten burgeoning British dominions off the coast of India. And, so when France enters, that's like an oh shit moment for Britain, because it's like, well, when the Americans decided to get all haughty and rebel, Britain was in a good place, public finance-wise. For the first time in a century, they were not at war with a major European power. We picked the worst moment to do this, But then when France comes on, it's like, okay, well, there is a traditional enemy we've fought against like 6 times in the past 100 years.
Yeah.
And France does all the things I said they could do potentially, with the exception of invading England. And in 1779, they were very close to doing it. There was going to be a combined Franco-Spanish fleet. A massive storm developed and blew that off course. But when France gets involved, it starts a grind to the war that's nonstop because North American winters, given logistics, poor road networks, warfare slows down in the winters, and you have encampments for major armies, right? But when it's war, when winter comes in North America, hurricane season just ended in the West Indies. So it's like, okay, well, go fight there now. And now you've got the British line with all 4 of its paws being stretched across the globe because after France gets involved, then the French go, woohoo, time for us to get back on board, settle old scores. The Dutch are going to do what they're going to do. And Britain's just overstretched by 1783. And it's just had enough. They really have. So, that's important.
So I have maybe 5 more minutes that I can do on this. And I know that we have... well, no. So what I'm thinking here is maybe what we do is a part 2. I didn't realize that you were semi-local.
Yeah.
So we could do a part 2 where we could go a little more in depth and get into the Gettysburg battle participants who have ancestors in the Revolutionary War.
I accept.
And we could spend more time on that instead of rush it through.
Yep.
Right?
I would be awesome, Matt. I would love to do that.
Okay.
I'm happy to come back on as many times as you have me. And I guess
good.
This means it's going okay.
No, I'm really having a good time.
All right. So
and you have a good voice for this, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Kind of hate it.
No, you have a better review.
No. I don't think so. I have to work at mine. You actually just talk.
It's very kind.
Well,
so I want to talk about one more person then, because he's reflective of this, divided consciousness, and I'll do that quickly. His name is Daniel Batwell, and he is an Episcopalian priest, and he is actually sent in 1774 as a missionary representative from the Anglican Church to tend to all of the congregations west of the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. And in 1776, 77, Pennsylvania is trying to foist these loyalty oaths on everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And Batwell, who ironically preached to Captain Michael Doodle's company early in the war when it was on its way to Boston,
Oh, I thought you were going to say, ironically, was a poor hitter.
Like, dun, dun. So he's preached to Continental troops before. And then Batwell in 1777 gets these visitors from the state of Pennsylvania. They're like, hey, take this oath.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, no. And they say, well, you have to, because if not, you're against us. And his response is basically that he has taken an oath as an Anglican priest. And part of that oath was loyalty to his bishop and to the head of the Anglican Church, who happens to be the King of England. And because of that solemn obligation, he cannot violate what he has already said in front of his God.
Right.
So instead of doing the sensible thing and going, okay, he's probably not a troublemaker, whatever, they decide to make an example of him. And they accuse him of forming a plot to destroy public stores and magazines at Lancaster, York, and Carlisle. And then they take him out to the Codorus Creek. They dunk him in it in front of the general public. They imprison him for 5 months. And then after they're done embarrassing the guy, who's now in poor health, they send him back to Philadelphia through British lines. And in 1780, Batwell is eventually back in London in very, very difficult health circumstances, impoverished, and is writing memorial letters to the British Crown, basically saying, this has been my experience serving you as a missionary in the wilds of America, and I need financial assistance. So,
did he get it?
I don't have any record that he did. But
well, I'll tell you what, those colonists are a bunch of dicks. That's, but you know what, though? That's the thing with war is that, you just get your tempers up.
Yeah.
You get your panties in a wad, and you do things like that to the poor guy. So I would be interested to know, though, if you ever find out if he did get any help from the Crown, because they're probably not too loyal to people who are loyal to them. You can't be.
Right. And so there's some research for episode 2.
Yeah.
Look at those.
There you go.
things.
I like that.
So that'd be great.
Follow up on that one. That's your homework.
All right. Sounds good. So just, just as we said 7 years before, it was, I guess it's a fitting closing point, at least for part 1, to say when we get post Battle of Gettysburg, and, the immediate thing Lincoln does with that address is he harkens back to 1776. And whether it's intentional or not, it is a callback to his first inaugural address. where he's talking about 1776 and better angels of our nature. And in the inaugural, he focuses on the conflict at hand potentially before us. But when you get to the Gettysburg Address, and he's talking about really what's at stake here, he talks about it in terms that are going to be encompassing more than just what's happening in the United States of America. He really talks about it in a way that it's much broader. He says that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Not this government, not government here, not the government of the United States, but the whole concept of government of the people, by the people, for the people, no matter where it exists or may. That's what's at stake.
Yeah.
That's what he's telling us at the end.
Yeah. Kenneth, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
For coming in.
My pleasure.
And thanks to Ralph Siegel for putting us in touch, because I really enjoyed this.
Good.
It's nice to talk
Good.
about something other than Gettysburg, the
Yeah.
Battle of
There you
Gettysburg,
go.
but still keep it in Gettysburg. So we're going to do a part 2 of this soon. And thank you, patrons, for watching this, the first lieutenants. And for those of you who are not first lieutenants and watching this, you're lucky. This goes to first lieutenants as soon as we end the feed. So go ahead and become a first lieutenant, especially if you're studying for the guide exam, because there's a lot of information that's available to you over there that might actually help you. Probably won't, because if you don't know it by now, they say you're never going to know it. So I don't know. Okay, I haven't taken the exam. I'm going to take the exam. I don't plan on passing. I mean, I plan on passing. If I pass, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. That's what I'm saying. Frankly, I can't see the forest for the trees from doing the show. I can't keep the whole story straight anymore, so I'm just going to see what comes out of my... But that's not the point. The point is you should join Patreon. It'll help us continue to do this show, but it'll also maybe teach you something you haven't heard before. We have a lot of people. There's over 300 episodes over there. And Kenneth is a patron, and you really enjoy the Joseph Fuquay episodes.
I do. They are hysterical, and if you're looking for a
which won't help you with the guide exam.
No, if you're looking for a light break from your studying from the guide exam, hit the Fuquay app and drink Little Ground Top. Copyright.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. That's right. Drink your Little Ground Top and enjoy it there. That's addressinggettysburg.com/cafe. All right. We'll talk to you guys next time.
Thanks, Matt.
Have a good one. Thank you, Kenneth. All righty.
All right. That was awesome.
Good. I'm glad
Lots
you
of
enjoyed
fun.
it.
Yeah, I had a
Yeah,
great time.
I didn't put I recognized your name, but I didn't put it together as the patron who said that about Joseph Fuquay when I thanked him, when you joined. And so now it's nice to put all of it together.
Yeah, it's good to finally meet.
Somebody in here asked, wait, let me see if I can find it. Suggestions on how to get a tour guide at Valley Forge. Do you still give tours?
I do. Yeah.
Well, so how would he do that?
I don't know. What do you think is best? I mean, they can have my personal email address.
It's up to you.
Yeah, if that's okay with you. I don't
Sure.
want to make you guys have to work as middlemen. So yeah, I can give you my email. Well, I should probably get your cell phone number anyway, Matt. I'll give you mine.
Well, I'll wait until I end the broadcast for that.
Am I still talking?
Yeah, we're
hearing
still on. I got to go in the
Okay.
other room to turn it off.
All right.
Grant, I saw your stupid little message and you retracted it. It wasn't funny. Grant's one of our listeners from Australia,
Oh, fun.
and he's coming up in October
Nice.
for the first time to Gettysburg.
Cool.
We're going to take him around and, haze him, basically. We'll have some people jump us. We'll make, oh, no, we didn't know that was going to happen. And then we'll kidnap him for a day or two and take him around. It'll be fun.
Nice.
He'll have a good time. Good old American experience,
Yeah, because there's that guy's not around. Do you remember the guy a couple years ago who used to run around saying crazy shit in town? He had a boater hat on. He would ride a bike leave this place. Gettysburg is a fraud. And then the police would show up 5 minutes later.
No, but I mean, you're not really narrowing it down either. All right. So I will talk to you guys later. Thanks.